Within the next few minutes, a radical truth will be unveiled. What society diagnoses as a symptom of disorder is often the signature of a profound psychological evolution. This is not about loneliness, but about a deliberate, powerful recalibration of the human psyche. The proof lies in the neuroscience of solitude and the hidden histories of history's most pivotal minds. The benefit is a liberation from a suffocating narrative, offering not just understanding, but a roadmap to transforming perceived weakness into an unparalleled intellectual and emotional fortress. The modern world operates on a deafening axiom: connection is king. The chatter of social media, the relentless schedule of gatherings, the quiet suspicion cast upon the quiet one in the corner, it all forms a chorus that equates being alone with being flawed. It whispers a question laced with pity: what is wrong with them? But what if that question is the very root of the misunderstanding? What if the pull toward solitude is not a retreat from humanity, but an advance toward a different frontier of the self? Psychology often pathologizes the preference for solitude, conveniently folding it into criteria for social anxiety or aversion disorder. Yet a significant body of research draws a bright, crucial line between the fear of social interaction and the simple preference for it. The latter is not a phobia, it is a choice, and often a strategic one. Think of the brain as having a budget, a finite amount of cognitive and emotional resources. For many, social interaction, especially the unstructured, performative kind demanded by casual gatherings, is an extraordinary expense. It requires constant sensory processing, emotional regulation, conversational tracking, and self-monitoring. This is not a deficiency, it is a form of high-fidelity processing that drains the battery faster. The proof is in the physiology. Dr. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi's seminal work on flow states, those periods of intense, joyful focus where time dissolves, reveals a critical truth. They are most frequently accessed in solitude. The brain requires freedom from external interruption to weave complex thoughts, to build intricate inner worlds, to create. Historical case studies are littered with these architects of solitude. Consider Nikola Tesla, who would retreat into weeks of isolated, furious work, his mind conducting symphonies of electromagnetic theory that would reshape the world. Symphonies that would have been drowned out by the mere politeness of a dinner party. His solitude was not a hollow space, it was a laboratory. The emotional hook here is one of reliability, of recognition. Imagine a person, let's call him Alex, who after a long week of work is invited to a Friday night gathering. Colleagues are excited, making plans. Alex feels a cold dread, a visceral weight in the stomach. It's not that Alex dislikes the people, it's that the very thought of the noise, the obligatory laughter, the energy required to navigate the social maze feels like being asked to run a marathon after just finishing one. So Alex invents an excuse, a polite fiction. And as the clock strikes the hour when the party begins, Alex is home. Not scrolling mindlessly, not weeping with loneliness, but sitting with a book, or walking in the quiet park, or simply thinking. The relief is palpable, a deep, sinking tranquility. The recharge begins. This moment, often shrouded in guilt, is in fact an act of precise self-regulation. It is the joy of homeostasis.
This preference is frequently born from a specific psychological soil: high sensitivity and deep processing. Elaine Aron's research on the highly sensitive person identifies a trait present in roughly 20% of the population, characterized by deeper cognitive processing of stimuli. For these individuals, a simple trip to a supermarket is a symphony of fluorescent lights, checkout beeps, fragmented conversations, and social micro-cues. It is overwhelming by design. Solitude, therefore, becomes the essential filter. It is not antisocial, it is the necessary silence after the overwhelming movement. But the narrative deepens, and here is where the shock and curiosity intertwine. Sometimes the draw to solitude is not just a preference, but a forged strength, a psychological adaptation born from early trauma. Attachment theory provides a window. A child whose emotional needs were met with inconsistency, neglect, or overwhelm learns a brutal lesson. Reliance on others is unsafe. The external world is unpredictable. So the psyche makes a brilliant, heartbreaking adaptation. It internalizes everything. The child learns to seek safety within the walls of their own mind, to find company in imagination, to rely on a self that, while perhaps lonely, is at least predictable. This is the genesis of the fortress self. In adulthood, this manifests not as a fear of people, but as a profound, often unconscious conviction that the deepest security is found alone. The psychology is clear. This is a survival mechanism that hardens into a worldview. The person is not broken, they are armored. Crazy psychological facts underscore this. Studies on creativity and isolation, like those examining the conditions of revolutionary artists and scientists, consistently find that periods of enforced or chosen solitude are not just correlated with breakthroughs, they are often the catalyst. The eureka moment is notoriously solitary. It happens in baths, in walks, in private studies. It avoids committees. Furthermore, neuroscience reveals that during states of quiet solitude, the brain activates its default mode network. This is not a passive state, it is an active, crucial circuit for self-reflection, autobiographical memory, and imagining the future. It is the brain, quite literally, doing its most important work of integrating the self. Society celebrates the networking brain, but the aloneness brain is where identity is woven. The inspiration begins here in this reframing. The person who consistently chooses their own company is not necessarily hiding, they might be building. They are engaging in what psychologists call self-determined solitude, a state linked to reduced stress, greater life satisfaction, and personal growth. They are the sculptors of their own consciousness, using silence as the chisel. The joy is in the autonomy, the mastery of one's own environment and attention. It is the quiet thrill of a thought followed to its conclusion without interruption, of a book that changes you because you were fully present for it, of a walk where the only conversation is between the rustling leaves and a racing, untethered mind. This is the first pillar of understanding, solitude as sanctuary. It is the conscious, often necessary withdrawal from the collective noise to preserve and cultivate a rich inner life. It is the recognition that for some minds, density of experience does not come from a crowded room, but from the uninterrupted depth of a single thought. But this is only half the story, the inward gaze. The sanctuary has walls, and walls can become barriers. The very strength that protects can also isolate in a more permanent, sometimes destructive way. Now we descend into the darker psychology of isolation, where the fortress mind becomes a locked room, and the trauma that built it threatens to become the entire foundation of identity. This is where dark psychology takes hold, revealing the terrifying line between empowered solitude and emotional exile, and more crucially, how to walk it.
The sanctuary of solitude, with its quiet joys and deep replenishment, has a shadow. Every fortress, no matter how magnificent, can become a prison if its doors become too heavy to open. This is the darker, more complex terrain where empowered choice begins to blur with unconscious compulsion. The same psychological adaptations that once saved a person can, over decades, slowly sever the very connections that make us human. This is not a contradiction to the first part, but its inevitable, chilling counterpart. A mind that learned to find supreme safety within itself can forget, or worse, forsake the language of reaching out. The transition is subtle, a psychological drift measured not in miles, but in millimeters. It begins with the reliable relief of turning down an invitation. Then it becomes a preference for the virtual over the physical, where interaction has an off switch. Then the fantasies of a life completely free of social obligation start to feel less like a peaceful daydream and more like a necessary goal. The external world, with its demands and unpredictability, is increasingly framed not just as draining, but as inherently threatening or pointless. This is where dark psychology takes root, a cynical, deterministic worldview that sees social bonds as transactional, superficial, or inherently damaging. It is a profound emotional surrender disguised as intellectual superiority. The psychology behind this shift is often anchored in deep, unprocessed trauma. Earlier, we saw how inconsistent care can forge a fortress self. But when that trauma is more severe, a history of betrayal, bullying, familial abandonment, or social ostracization, the adaptation hardens into something more rigid. The brain, in its desperate quest to prevent future pain, generalizes. It moves from "that specific situation was unsafe" to "all social situations are unsafe." This is a cognitive distortion known as overgeneralization, and it builds the walls brick by brick. The person isn't just enjoying solitude, they are enforcing it as a dogma of self-preservation. The joy of autonomy curdles into the rigidity of control. Consider a crazy story, a psychological case study that reads like a thriller. There was a man, brilliant, capable, who lived in a metropolitan city yet had spoken to no one beyond essential transactions for over 2 years. His apartment was his universe. His work was freelance, done remotely. His groceries were delivered. He had systematically eliminated the need for human contact, and he reported feeling a cold, clean sense of safety. Yet, during therapy conducted via video call, a shocking detail emerged. He kept a detailed, almost poetic journal of the lives of his neighbors, observed through his window. He knew their routines, their conflicts, their joys. He was, in a ghostly way, profoundly connected to them, yet entirely insulated. His solitude was no longer a sanctuary, it was a glass coffin. He could observe life, but not participate in it. His psychology revealed a devastating truth. The need for connection had not vanished, it had become a haunting, a spectator sport, because the risk of actual engagement felt fatal.
This is the shocking reality of chronic, compulsive isolation. It doesn't always look like sadness. It can look like hyperproductivity, intellectual arrogance, or serene detachment. It is a state of existential bypassing, where the messy, vulnerable, and unpredictable parts of being human are treated as bugs in a system rather than features of the experience. The brain, in its isolated state, can weave elaborate, self-justifying narratives. It will quote philosophers on the vulgarity of the crowd, cite studies on the superficiality of small talk, and frame its own isolation as a form of purity or evolutionary advantage. This is the psychological immune system working overtime, not to heal, but to protect a wound it has grown around. The research on long-term isolation is brutal and clear. It is not just an emotional state, it is a physiological and neurological storm. Chronic loneliness, which can be the outcome of prolonged compulsory solitude, has been linked by meta-analyses to a 26% increased risk of premature mortality, rivaling the risks of smoking and obesity. It triggers a constant low-grade fight-or-flight response, flooding the system with cortisol, eroding cardiovascular health, and weakening the immune system.
Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to adapt and rewire, can work in reverse. The neural pathways dedicated to social perception and empathy can atrophy from disuse. The shocking fact is this: the brain of someone in prolonged, unwanted isolation begins to resemble one under constant threat. It becomes hypervigilant to social cues, but in a negatively biased way, misinterpreting neutral expressions as hostile, seeing rejection where none exists. This creates a vicious, heartbreaking cycle. The isolation meant to protect breeds a psychology that justifies further isolation. The fortress becomes a locked room, and the key is thrown away. But here is where the narrative must pivot, not into blame, but into understanding and the possibility of inspiration. Recognizing this pattern is not an indictment, it is the first brave step toward a different kind of strength. The goal is not to demolish the fortress, but to install a door, a functioning, conscious door that one can choose to open or close. This is the journey from isolation to integrated solitude. The process begins with a ruthless curiosity directed inward. People in this state must ask a terrifying question: is my solitude a choice or a compulsion? Is it, I enjoy this, or I need this to feel safe from a world I've decided is dangerous? The distinction lives in the body. The relief of chosen solitude feels like expansion, like a deep breath. The relief of compulsive isolation feels like contraction, like a narrow escape. The work is to challenge the overgeneralized beliefs. This is not about forcing oneself to party, but about micro-exposures. It is the psychological equivalent of physical therapy for an atrophied limb. It could be making brief eye contact and smiling at a barista, joining a highly structured, topic-focused online forum, or even volunteering in a context where the interaction is side by side rather than face to face, like an animal shelter. The objective is not to become the life of the party, but to rewire the brain's prediction that all social contact equals danger.
The most powerful tool in this recalibration is the concept of secure base exploration, drawn from attachment theory. Just as a securely attached child ventures out to explore the world, knowing they can return to a safe caregiver, an adult can learn to build a secure base within themselves. This means cultivating that inner sanctuary from part one so fiercely that it becomes a truly safe place to return from. When the internal world is rich, stable, and self-validating, the external world becomes less threatening. A rejection, a social misstep, an awkward silence. These events are no longer catastrophic proofs of one's unworthiness, but merely data points. They can be processed and stored in the fortress, not as reasons to lock the door forever, but as maps of the sometimes treacherous outer terrain. The inspirational culmination is the emergence of what might be called the integrated sovereign. This is the person who has moved through the sanctuary, faced the darkness of the locked room, and emerged with a key. Their solitude is deliberate, cherished, and nourishing, but they also possess the capacity for genuine, chosen connection. They engage not from neediness or social obligation, but from a place of abundance and curiosity. Their relationships are fewer but deeper, because they are not using others to fill a void, but to meet in a shared space of mutual interest. Their psychology is marked by what Carl Jung termed individuation, a wholeness where the need for community and the need for solitude are not at war, but in dialogue. This is the ultimate emotional hook, a vision of profound self-sufficiency that does not preclude love, but makes it more authentic. It is the lonely person who stopped seeking a savior in others and instead became their own sanctuary, only to find that from that position of strength, they could finally see others clearly, not as threats or remedies, but as fellow, complex beings. The journey from loneliness to solitude to connection is not a straight line, but a spiral. It returns to the same themes: aloneness, fear,
courage, but each time from a higher, more integrated level. The story ends not with an extroverted conversion, but with a hard-won balance. Picture Alex again, years later. They still feel that familiar weight at the thought of the Friday night crowd, but now they understand its source. Some Fridays they choose the book, the walk, the deep recharge, with zero guilt. It is a celebration of their nature. But on another Friday, they might choose a one-on-one dinner with a single trusted friend, or attend a small workshop on a passionate interest. The interaction is not draining because it is chosen from alignment, not fear. The fortress stands, but its gates are open, its drawbridge lowered at the sovereign's command. The psychology of people who like to be alone is not a pathology to be cured. It is a spectrum to be understood, a power to be harnessed, and for some, a dragon to be faced in the deepest caves of the self. The victory is not in slaying it, but in learning to ride it, to use its vision in the darkness and its strength to guard a peace that finally, blessedly, includes the possibility of others.